Are children really responsible for the sins of their parents? Is it true that there is a boomerang effect? And is it true that the fate of villains gives them the ironic chance to be in the shoes of their own victims? And it is also said that women look for a man who looks like their father, but what if their father is a serial killer? Tonight we will hear a completely wild story that began with the disappearance of Melissa Wolfenbarger. The last time Melissa's mother Norma telephoned her was on Thanksgiving, November 26, 1998. They talked about the upcoming Christmas, about gifts, and made plans for the weekend. Melissa wanted to visit her parents with her husband and their 2 children over the holidays. However, when Christmas came, neither daughter nor son-in-law and grandchildren showed up at the Pattons' house. Norma and Karl knew that Melissa would never miss a family celebration, and even if there was a good reason, the young woman always called her father and mother to let them know she was unable to make it. This time it was different. There was little the parents could do at that moment, because Melissa was a mature 21-year-old woman. She was married to her high school sweetheart Christopher Wolfenbarger and was raising 2 small children, 3-year-old Christina and 2-year-old Joey. The couple and the little ones lived in a duplex in Atlanta and wanted to visit Melissa's parents' home in La Grove, Georgia, where she had spent her childhood over the holidays. During a phone call about Christmas, Melissa asked her mother to send her a picture with her grandmother. Norma promised to buy a beautiful frame the photo, and put the gift for her daughter under the tree. Unfortunately, Melissa was never able to admire her parents' gift. It remained wrapped under the tree, and that was in 1998. For a long time, cell phones didn't exist back then, and so the Patton parents and other family members tried to contact Melissa for a long time, but there was no answer. In January, Norma and Karl could no longer bear the strange silence, got into their car, and drove to their daughter's house in Atlanta to get an answer to the questions that preoccupied them. When the parents arrived at the duplex on Brooklyn Avenue, they found it empty. The apartment was completely cleared out, as if no one had ever lived there. The worried mother turned to the neighbors and learned that her daughter's family had moved elsewhere. A neighbor had heard them loading their things between Christmas and New Year's, but the Wolfenbarger couple had left no forwarding address, no note, no warning. The whole family had simply disappeared. Norma and Karl didn't want to give up and try more to see their daughter. They located the company where they believed their son-in-law Christopher worked and drove there. It was a glass company. In the office, they learned that Christopher had indeed been fired because he was involved in an accident with one of the company's trucks. According to the company, the man had worked there from October 1998 to 1999. So the management had no idea where Christopher was now. The parents had no choice but to drive home empty-handed. In February, Norma had her birthday, and the woman hoped her daughter would call to congratulate her, but that didn't happen. At that moment, the mother realized that something terrible had happened to Melissa. She was devastated when she learned that her little daughter would never come home again. Melissa Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, and grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, with her older sister Tina Patton. She was always cheerful, friendly, and trusting, loved animals, and dragged home all the kittens and puppies found in the neighborhood. In the future, Melissa wanted to become a veterinarian and save 4-legged pets. Together with Tina, they participated in school beauty pageants and were very close. Character traits like kindness and trustworthiness accompanied Melissa later in life. Only teenage rebellion was added. As a result, she got into trouble with the law for minor offenses. The girl snuck out of her bedroom window to go to parties with boys. Through this rowdy behavior, Melissa fell in love with a man who didn't particularly impress her parents, but the high school student was in a hurry to grow up, so she married her high school sweetheart Christopher and moved to the city with him. After the marriage, everything ran like clockwork. When she turned 21, Melissa was the proud mother of 2 children and enjoyed her role as a married woman. But in the winter of 1998, everything changed. At that time, the young woman suddenly disappeared and no one ever saw her again. Her parents tried to search for their youngest daughter in hospitals, morgues, and even in local jails. They knew that Melissa had worked for a while at the candy store with her older sister Tina. But the management of Denny's said the young woman hadn't shown up for work in over a month. They had no knowledge that Wolfenbarger had taken another job. One day she simply didn't show up for work and didn't notify anyone. Her colleagues stopped by her place, but the neighbors said Melissa's family had moved elsewhere. The next year, 1999, nothing more was heard from the young woman. The mother and father prayed that their daughter would come home alive. They hoped until the last minute that Melissa had a good reason not to call her parents. After months of waiting and searching on their own, Norma Patton filed a missing person report in January 2000. When she contacted the police, Atlanta officers were able to locate Christopher Wolfenbarger, the husband of the missing Melissa. But his wife was not with him, nor were his children. Christopher revealed that Melissa had left to pursue her dream. Allegedly, she had long wanted to start a new life in California, and one day she simply disappeared. Norma and Karl, however, were 100% sure that their daughter would never abandon her children, and something was clearly wrong here. But since her spouse did not report her disappearance and Melissa was an adult woman who did not have to account for her actions to her parents, the police did not give her search due attention. Moreover, the young woman's disappearance itself was a big problem. There was no crime scene, nor any evidence that anything had happened to Melissa. Her husband Christopher assured them that she had long planned to move to California. The woman worked double shifts at the pastry shop to earn more money and sometimes even rented a hotel room so as not to have to drive after a long shift. One day, Melissa didn't come home at all. At first, Christopher assumed she would come back later. But when his wife didn't show up the next day either, he realized she had decided to put her plan into action and had gone to California alone. So, according to Wolfenbarger, nothing unusual happened. Investigators tried to pressure Christopher by pointing to his criminal record, but the man explained that all that was long forgotten. He and his wife were like Bonnie and Clyde, only on a smaller scale, a bit rowdy in their youth before they married. However, as it later turned out, this was not entirely true. Melissa complained to the police about her husband, accusing him of domestic violence. She claimed Chris had repeatedly raised his hand against her. On one occasion, he had drugged her with illegal substances and then dragged her down the street by her hair. Christopher filed a counterclaim in response to Melissa's complaint. At one point, the woman packed her bags and moved in with her sister, but returned a week later to get the babies. The relationship between the two was very tense, but when the judge clarified the situation, Chris asked for permission to speak to his wife alone. After a short conversation, Melissa withdrew her statement and returned to her husband. After all, they had 2 children who were just growing up. When his wife suddenly disappeared, Christopher moved out of the duplex to his relatives and sent the children to his mother. So, Joey and Christina now lived with their grandmother, and their father visited them occasionally. Since the children were very young, they quickly forgot their mother, and they only remembered Daddy's existence when Chris came to his mother's house. Norma Patton explained that Melissa's husband never liked her. Because of him, her daughter ran away from home after barely finishing school and hastily jumped into marriage. Her older sister Tina remembered once noticing a handprint on Melissa's neck. Melissa cried and begged her not to tell anyone. Her brother had a man-to-man talk with Christopher, and that was the end of the matter. In any case, Karl and Norma Patton did not believe that their daughter could have run away without telling anyone, and even if it had actually happened, she would still have found a way to contact her parents. But time passed and Melissa's situation did not become known. The young woman, a mother of two small children, simply vanished into thin air. Ironically, Christopher Wolfenbarger testified in an interrogation in 2000 that he had seen Melissa on the street in front of their house in March or April 1999, although he had previously said he last saw her in December 1998. The situation of her disappearance remained unchanged. 5 years later, in 2003, Melissa's family was again in the spotlight because one of its members was locked in a prison cell. And it was not Christopher, but Karl Patton, Melissa's father. In mid-1983, Karl Patton was arrested for theft. The man served a short prison sentence and was then released on probation. After that, Patton was no longer noticed as a criminal and was never arrested again. However, it turned out that he had committed the offense back in 1977, and it was only solved more than 20 years later after his involvement was proven by a DNA test. On February 23, 2003, Karl Patton was arrested for the massacre of 31-year-old Liddy Matthew Evans, who lived with a man named Joe Krivel, Karl Patton's best friend. The woman's body was found in the river, stuffed into a sleeping bag and chained to a concrete block. Liddy had died from a gunshot to the head, and that was not the only crime Melissa's father had committed. Minutes after Karl's arrest, his wife Norma announced that she was willing to testify against her husband if she received immunity. A deal was struck between her and the prosecutor's office, and Melissa's mother testified incriminatingly against her husband. According to Norma, Karl Patton and his friend, 28-year-old Joe Quint, committed a series of crimes between 1970 and 1977. First, Karl Patton, along with a friend, shot and killed his own uncle. When the 45-year-old acquaintance learned of the massacre of White and his lover, the man persuaded his wife to help him get rid of the tattletale who could cause the family a lot of trouble, and the wife helped. According to Norma's testimony, on December 17, 1977, Karl lured his best friend Joe and his girlfriend for a visit, where he shot them with a shotgun right on the couch. The bodies were wrapped in sleeping bags weighed down and thrown into the river. After that, Norma cleaned the house, washed off the blood, and destroyed the evidence, and Karl burned the blood-stained couch in the backyard. Norma forgot to wash the blood off a boot, and a few days later, traces of blood were found in the river. Patton's wife was interrogated because she was among the suspects in the massacre after traces of blood were found in the trunk of the van. Although the blood type found in the vehicle matched Liddy Evans's, Patton was not charged due to lack of other evidence and was only forcibly released towards the end of 2002. A second DNA test revealed that Karl Patton was indeed involved in the crime, and on February 23, 2003, he was arrested in his own home. As it turned out, the father of the missing Melissa Wolfenbarger was a friend of a relative or their partner. So it was not difficult to suspect that this man was capable of taking his own daughter's life. Perhaps she had seen something or was about to report him to the police. Law enforcement authorities also suspected Karl's involvement in Melissa's disappearance. Patton, however, was not charged with the massacre of his daughter. According to Karl, he would never take the life of an innocent person, only people who could harm his family. However, many still believed that Melissa was the fifth victim of Karl Patton. There were also theories related to the mafia, which operated in the southern United States in the 1960s. The criminal organization was known for carrying out contract killings, especially of former members. Karl Patton was said to have been a member of this mafia group and was considered a good marksman. In March 2003, Norma testified in the case of the massacre of Fred White and his lover Betty Jo that Karl and Joe killed them for selfish motives. Fred's official wife took out a life insurance policy on her husband because he was cheating on her with Betty and hired Patton, who promised to pay a considerable sum to eliminate the unfaithful spouse. After committing a crime against his own uncle, Karl regretted the act and now pleaded guilty to the charges. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 20 years. He was then transferred to another district where his trial for the violent deaths of Liddy Evans and Joe Krivler began. Then he pleaded guilty again and received 2 more life sentences. His wife Norma pleaded guilty to perjury and withholding evidence and received a 10-month suspended sentence and a $1,000 fine. The old case of Karl Patton was handled by Bruce Jordan. After 25 years, he had managed to track down and arrest a serial killer, and now it was the convict who asked him to find his missing daughter Melissa. Wolfenbarger considers Jordan a professional because he managed to catch the perpetrator even after a quarter of a century. The Patton family believed from the beginning that Karl could not have taken his youngest daughter's life. He loved his girls and was devastated. Norma believed that a completely different man was responsible for Melissa's disappearance. Bruce Jordan took on the Wolfenbarger case after the news of the reopening of the long-standing story was published in the newspaper. He received a tip from a morgue in Atlanta. The medical examiner reported that the morgue had been storing unidentified remains for 4 years. It turned out that as early as April 1999, the severed head of an unidentified man had been found near where Melissa's family lived. And in June 1999, authorities found human limbs in 4 trash bags in a wooded area in the same vicinity. Initially, it was assumed that the remains were related to the severed head, but since the torso was never found, all remains were classified as male. At the time of the discovery of the human body parts, Melissa Wolfenbarger had not yet been reported missing. The gruesome finds were not identified because the man's death was clearly due to a crime. The body parts were not buried but left for storage. These remains were found near the local glass company where Christopher Wolfenbarger once worked. Norma Patton heard about the find in the news. At the time, it was reported that the deceased was most likely a white male. The woman had been upset for years that it was not her daughter, and only now, after all these years, did she learn that the remains belonged to Melissa. When the convicted felon Karl Patton learned that his daughter was probably dead, he couldn't bear it and cried. What shocked the man most was the fact that her body had been found a long time ago, but to identify her, the dead woman's father would have to be arrested. But the worst thing was that a DNA test was not carried out immediately. When Melissa's mother informed the police about her daughter's disappearance in early 2000, the woman's body remained unidentified until 2003, when the DNA from the body was compared to Karl Patton's. This also meant that some important evidence had probably been lost over time. The autopsy revealed that Melissa's neck had been severed with a saw, and there was practically no hair left on the skull because it had been filled with bleach. For this reason, the remains were initially identified as male. It is not known whether these actions were carried out after the woman's death or if she was tortured while alive. The head and limbs, including arms, legs, and feet, were packed in trash bags and disposed of. The burial site was not chosen randomly, as there was always heavy traffic there, and it was impossible to trace the vehicle that transported the bodies. The exact cause of death could also not be determined because the torso was missing and never found. When Christopher Wolfenbarger learned of the discovery of his missing wife's remains, he was in no hurry to collect them. Norma Patton, Melissa's mother, believed that Chris was responsible for her death. The woman never liked the man and did not want her daughter to marry him. To make matters worse, the body parts were scattered in close proximity to Chris's workplace. The police called Wolfenbarger for a second interrogation. During the questioning, Christopher stated that he had always cooperated with the investigation and had even provided a lot of information years ago. He had nothing to hide and absolutely no reason to take Melissa's life, according to the man. They had no insurance policies, they had no assets. Besides, he would never have aroused suspicion and disposed of the body near his workplace. Christopher also admitted to reporters that he truly believed his wife had changed her name and left in search of a better life. Deep down, he hoped she would come back sooner or later, at least for the children's sake. That's why he didn't report her disappearance to the police. Melissa's loss was felt most strongly by her older sister Tina. For a long time, she could not come to terms with the fact that the case was not solved. Tina even dreamed that Melissa was reaching out to her, calling for help. Karl Patton, who found himself in prison and could not say goodbye to his daughter, changed a lot. After finding justice for Melissa, the man finally realized what it was like to lose loved ones. His daughter's death showed him what other families had gone through and that no one deserves such a thing. The most shocking aspect of the case was that the serial killer spent most of his time in prison fighting for justice for his youngest daughter. But before he did that, he confessed to his fifth crime. Karl told investigators that on March 8, 1973, 4 years before the crimes for which he had already been convicted, he had taken the life of a man named Richard Russell Jackson. His uncle's wife, who later hired Karl to massacre her unfaithful husband. He first asked Patton for a favor involving another criminal. According to the client, Richard Jackson was her first husband, who had abused, insulted, and humiliated her throughout her life. Now that she was married to Fred White, Karl's uncle, she wanted revenge. So Patton freed this woman from both her spouses. Unfortunately, there was no way to verify this statement, as Maria White had already died in 1988, 10 years before Melissa's disappearance and 35 years before Patton's confession. When Karl was again extradited to another district to stand trial, he testified that he and his friend Joe had lured Richard into a car, driven him to a deserted area, and then shot him. Everyone present was shocked by the statement of the victim's daughter. Gladys Jackson, the young woman, thanked Karl Patton in a statement. Miss Jackson told the court that her father had constantly abused her mother, Mary, and that Fred White, Gladys's next husband and stepfather, had also raised his hand against her mother. In the woman's opinion, these two men were the monsters of her childhood. All she remembered were her mother's blood, bruises, and broken bones. By sending both of them to the other world, Mr. Patton did Maria and her children a favor. Otherwise, one of the two men would have beaten his wife to death sooner or later. However, the family of the deceased Richard Jackson assured that Maria was manipulative and only wanted the insurance money. That's why she hired Karl Patton to eliminate her two husbands. Melissa's father was eventually sentenced to another life term. Karl told the police that no one else had suffered because of him. However, the authorities were very skeptical of such a statement from the defendant. This man had taken 5 lives, and then he suddenly behaved like a law-abiding citizen for 20 years. Investigators were sure of one thing: Karl loved his daughter and would never harm her. So Melissa's remains were found, but no one was arrested or charged with her death. In 2017, Norma Patton asked the cold case investigator to help her investigate her daughter's case. Cheryl McCollum, founder and director of the Cold Case Research Institute, often hosts a popular show that delves into unsolved cases. She is also the host of the Zone 7 podcast. Cheryl remembers exactly the moment she first saw Norma Patton. It was at a formal dinner in honor of an event she was hosting. While McCollum was on stage, she noticed a woman entering the room wearing clothes more suited to the beach than a formal dinner. When the event was over, the stranger approached the host and said, "My daughter's head was chopped off and I need your help." That was Norma Patton. Without hesitation, McCollum agreed to hear her story. Norma really had a story to tell. Armed with folders full of information, she was ready to talk. A woman tired of seeking justice for her daughter bluntly pointed out to the host of the Zone 7 podcast that her husband was in prison for the massacre of 5 people, and she herself had received a suspended sentence for helping him dispose of the bodies. But now it was no longer about her, but about her missing daughter. McCollum said she needed to speak with Karl Patton to create a complete victimology. But in the meantime, she herself had contacted search specialists who, with their dogs, were to research the wooded area where the black garbage bags containing Melissa's remains had been found. Cheryl had hoped to find the torso or at least clues that would help get to the bottom of the matter. Unfortunately, it was in vain. Miss Patton persuaded McCollum to continue and talk to anyone who agreed, because you never know who will end up being the right person to help. So Cheryl continued to investigate Melissa's case. The investigator had a long correspondence with the father of the missing young woman. In the correspondence, Karl Patton expressed his opinion about the man responsible for his daughter's death. One man was clearly named as a suspect: Melissa's husband and Karl's son-in-law, Christopher Wolfenbarger. Patton had no other candidates. Melissa's father mentioned that he would not only take Chris's life for his own grandchildren. If he were ever released from prison, he would not miss the chance to get to know him better and share their fate. The man remembered the first time he held Melissa in his arms and felt his heart beat in her. She was a happy, pretty young girl who did well in school and had a bright future ahead of her. But everything changed when she met Christopher Wolfenbarger. This man had a negative influence on her. Her daughter began to climb out the window at night just to meet him. Chris taught her to steal. The young people tried to steal Karl's car twice to flee to California. When Melissa became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter, her husband did everything to keep her and her granddaughter Christina away from her grandparents. The only time they could meet was when Chris was at work. Melissa said she would get into big trouble if her husband found out about her parents' visit. Despite the constant bruises on her arms and neck that Chris left on her body, she was in love with him and wouldn't listen to anyone. Her mother and father tried to reason with her, but she believed everything would be fine. When his daughter didn't show up for Christmas and her parents couldn't find her, Karl knew in his heart and sensed that Chris had done something to Melissa. But the father couldn't prove it. What angered him most was that his grandchildren didn't even know that their mother hadn't left them and gone in search of a better life, but had died. Karl tried in every way possible to support the investigation. His kind attitude towards his daughter and his sincere desire to find the person responsible for Melissa's death removed the last suspicion from him. Although after 5 confessions of massacres, the police had considered the idea that Patton had a hand in his daughter's disappearance. Karl insisted that forensic scientists re-examine the garbage bags in which the remains were found for DNA traces. When the perpetrator tied the knots, he might have left a seemingly inconspicuous clue because there is no such thing as a perfect crime. However, investigators could find no evidence of Christopher's involvement in his wife's disappearance. At the end of the letter, Patton thanked the host for taking on his daughter's case. Karl also mentioned that he had to lose Melissa and feel the pain to truly understand the harm he had done to people who lost loved ones due to his criminal actions. The Zone 7 host then interviewed the children of Liddy Evans because the public thought that Melissa might have been killed by relatives of Karl's victims. Perhaps someone wanted to take revenge on him this way. But the thing is, Melissa's father's crime only came to light years after her disappearance. Liddy Evans's children agreed to talk about their mother on the podcast and help Melissa. They believe that the mother of 2 also deserved justice, even though she herself was the daughter of a criminal who took the life of his own relative. Podcast host Cheryl read them one of Karl's letters in which he wrote that he prayed for their forgiveness. Medical examiner Joseph Morgan spoke about the autopsy and the perpetrator's profile. In his opinion, the act had personal motives. He also suggested that the dismemberment did not take place in the duplex where the Wolfenbarger couple lived. It could have happened at the glass company where Christopher previously worked, as the remains were found in the dumpster behind the building and suitable tools were available there. However, no blood or DNA traces were found at the production site, so investigators could never find the crime scene and find out where Melissa's body was dismembered. Cheryl spoke with Norma and Melissa's sister Tina, communicated with Karl via letters, consulted with specialists, and brought in experts. They familiarized themselves with the files and reviewed the independent investigation, but this work took a very long time. All involved leaned towards the same version of the crime and all suspected the same person, Christopher Wolfenbarger. Cheryl said she would risk her reputation, but she would achieve a conviction for the death of a young woman, a mother of two. Melissa's case was one of the first to be told on the Zone 7 podcast, which launched in February 2023, and in April of the following year, 2024, a knowledgeable listener came forward and shared important information. This person reported witnessing the Wolfenbarger couple's behavior at a party. Cheryl McCollum immediately passed this information on to the lead investigators. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, the case dramatically gained momentum, and in the following months, Melissa's husband was arrested in early August with lightning speed on suspicion of murder. The Clayton County officer leading the investigation into Melissa's case wanted to personally contact her father to inform him of his son-in-law's arrest. Back in 2003, the officer had personally told the inmate on the phone that his daughter's body had been identified only because of Karl's persistence. The policeman who had been investigating the case for years didn't want the father to find out from anyone else, but unfortunately, the inmate was only allowed to make calls on Thursdays. Consequently, the police officer drove to the prison to personally tell Karl Patton about the arrest. Like a grieving father, Karl Patton was devastated and jumping for joy because he had been right about his son-in-law. And on August 7, the Atlanta police held a press conference where they answered some questions that interested many people and informed the public about the arrest of Christopher Wolfenbarger, a man who had been among the suspects in this case from the beginning. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses, pursued further leads, and tried new techniques to gather all the facts. They established sufficient suspicion for an arrest and were finally able to take the suspect into custody. Police officers described how Christopher's arrest occurred. He was found in his home in Griffin, hiding behind a dryer. It is unlikely that an innocent man would hide from law enforcement officers. The man continued to protest his innocence while being taken to jail. The officers did not provide specific details about what evidence they had against Christopher or what his motives might have been. Although he was arrested, a trial was still pending, so the secrecy of the investigation was maintained. The mother and older sister of the deceased Melissa were also present at the press conference. Norma said she no longer needed to watch the news because the perpetrator had been caught. All in all, her daughter had been found, and he was now behind bars. The elderly woman said a prayer that Christopher would stay there forever. Now they had one last hurdle to overcome to achieve Wolfenbarger's conviction. For 25 years, this family had waited for justice for Melissa. They never stopped believing that the investigation would one day end and their faith was rewarded. Norma Patton saw true evil in Christopher's eyes. She even compared her son-in-law's gaze to a picture of Charlie Manson. Unfortunately, the parents were unable to protect their daughter from this man. But the story of Melissa Wolfenbarger can serve as an example of the consequences domestic violence can have on families. Many members of the public have no sympathy and believe that the suffering that befell the Patton family is merely a punishment from above for their sins. The convicted criminal Karl Patton, who took 5 lives, has already admitted his guilt and repented, but time cannot be turned back. To realize this, he had to survive the death of his beloved daughter. Melissa's children were in the care of Christopher's mother the entire time. The bereaved family was not allowed to see them. Norma, Karl, and Tina hoped that as adults, the children would finally learn how much their mother loved them and that she only stayed with Chris for their sake. Christopher's and Melissa's now adult daughter, Christina, said that she was very angry with her father in her late teens. Every time the conversation turned to her mother, the man either told her a completely different story or kept quiet. So she began to search for information on social media and one day came across the story of Melissa Wolfenbarger's disappearance. 18-year-old Christina contacted her Aunt Tina and her grandmother Norma and they met. She immediately felt a connection. Since then, the two have been inseparable. Reuniting with her mother's family filled a void in her heart that had accompanied her since childhood. Christina said that nothing would ever bring her mother back, but she got the chance to at least learn what kind of person she was. Christina's only memory is of sitting in the back seat of a car as a toddler, listening to her happy mother Melissa sing during the drive. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves.